Yeah, we're not going to have microphones, so everybody will have to eat like somewhere quietly. So welcome everyone to coming for our first semester's bilateral of the S Postgrad Council, and I hope you'll all enjoy your falafeling. I'm Amelie Lohmann. I'm the second year representative on the Grad Council for the German European Studies program, and Liam is the first year representative. He's sitting somewhere in the back. And Ryan Menina is the first year representative for the SSP program, and so we're the ones who have organized this for today. We wanted to welcome our two representatives from both our programs to speak to us today on Transatlantic Counterterrorism Cooperation. From the Security Studies program, we have Dr. Daniel Byman, who is not only professor in the SSP program, but also at the Department of Government and the Senior Associate Dean for Undergraduate Affairs. Professor Byman has written extensively on a range of topics related to terrorism, international security, civil and ethnic conflict, and the Middle East. His newest book is titled Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Global Jihadist Movement, What Everyone Needs to Know, from 2015, if everybody's interested in getting it. From the Majors program, we have Dr. Newman. He's an associate professor in our program, and he's also at the Government Department and the director of the Matora Center for International Studies. He's the senior editor at the International Studies Quarterly, and his research focuses on the way in which economic interdependence and globalization have transformed international politics. He's the co-author of Voluntary Disruptions, International Soft Law, Finance and Power. From this book came out this year. And for today's topic, we're going to hear all about the different forms of transatlantic counterterrorism cooperation. It will be interesting to see it from both sides, both the European and the American side. And I hope that after the first 10 minutes from each speaker, I think you can decide on who starts first. We'll have a Q&A session, and I hope that you'll be grilling them on all kinds of different terrorism definitions, state-sponsored terrorism, and just in general transatlantic cooperation. And thank you. And let me join me in Hollywood.
These aren't.
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, so welcome and thank you for the invitation. Just to give you a little background, my expertise is really about data privacy, and that is how I cut into data privacy and surveillance. I wrote my first book was about mostly commercial privacy, how personal information is shared between the US and Europe amongst firms. And I'm currently finishing a book that will probably be out a year from now with Princeton University Press that will be much more focused on surveillance and these counterterrorism related issues. And so that's the way I cut into this conversation. Let me just start by saying I kind of have 4 points that I'd like to get across. The first is that information right now in the global economy is power. And especially in the area of counterterrorism, it is kind of a vital tool that governments use in order to manage threats that they find themselves confronting. Hank Paulson, when he was describing the information strategy of the Treasury Department, said, "It is one of the most powerful actions that can be taken short of military action." And in the response to 9/11 in particular, the United States and its European partners developed a whole series of initiatives in order to use information collection and analysis in order to better target and to manage terrorist threats. And I'm just going to talk about 2 specific ways that information has become very powerful for the US and Europe. One of them I think of as kind of the panopticon. The panopticon, that was a term that Jeremy Bentham came up, where you have a prison, you sit at the center of the prison and you can see everything that's happening in the yards. And that is that information is used to track, surveil, and as a forensic tool in order to figure out what are terrorist organizations doing, and also who are they collaborating with and how are they behaving. But the second way that information can be very important is as a choke.
Thank you. And let me join me in Hollywood.
These aren't.
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, so welcome and thank you for the invitation. Just to give you a little background, My expertise is really about data privacy, and that is how I cut into data privacy and surveillance. I wrote my first book was about mostly commercial privacy, how personal information is shared between the US and Europe amongst firms. And I'm currently finishing a book that will probably be out a year from now with Princeton University Press that will be much more focused on surveillance and these counterterrorism related issues. And so that's the kind of the way I cut into this conversation. Let me just start by saying I kind of have 4 points that I'd like to get across. The first is that information right now in the global economy is power. And especially in the area of counterterrorism, it is kind of a vital tool that governments use in order to manage threats that they find themselves confronting. Hank Paulson, when he was describing the information strategy of the Treasury Department, said, "It is one of the most powerful actions that can be taken short of military action." And in the response to 9/11 in particular, the United States and its European partners developed a whole series of initiatives in order to use information collection and analysis in order to better target and to manage terrorist threats. And I'm just going to talk about 2 specific ways that information has become very powerful for the US and Europe. One of them I think of as kind of the panopticon. The panopticon, that was a term that Jeremy Bentham came up, where you have a prison, you sit at the center of the prison and you can see everything that's happening in the yards. And that is that information is used to track, surveil, and as a forensic tool in order to figure out what are terrorist organizations doing, and also who are they collaborating with and how are they behaving. But the second way that information can be very important is as a choke point, and that is about eliminating the communication, the transfer of money, ways that terrorist organizations are cooperating across borders. And so I think just the first point that I want to get across is that information itself is a very powerful tool in the international system, particularly in the transatlantic space, in addressing terrorist threats. And that's both because it serves in this panopticon capacity, but also as a choke point. The second major point that I want to stress is that the regimes, the ways that Europe and the United States manage information differ considerably. And this is a major impediment to this tool that I just kind of stressed in the first point. And these are mostly located in the privacy systems that the 2 regions have constructed over a series of many years, that they have different perspectives on how available and who should have access to this information that is an important counterterrorism tool. And in the United States, we would have, in general, we have a very laissez-faire version of information management. There is something called the Privacy Act, which was passed in the 70s, but it does not cover private sector data. So you might be restricted in how governments can collect, share, and transmit data, but the private sector's use of data is almost unrestricted. So if you're Amazon or Google, you're restricted by your privacy statements, which are things you come up with yourself. You write your own privacy statement, and then because of you have to, if you say you're going to do something, you have to live by it, so they have to follow that. But in our current world, that is not very limiting. Google, Amazon, they've become basically information vacuums, and they're using that in order to respond to customer demands primarily. But the thing that has happened in our current world is that governments increasingly turn to these private sector actors for the information that they're using to fight terrorism and other state challenges. Okay, so that's the US setting. But in the European setting, there is a very different system, a privacy regime in place. It's a comprehensive system that has rules that govern both the public sector and the private sector. There are independent regulators, much like the Free Trade Commission in the United States. There's an independent regulator just for privacy that oversees both how governments and businesses collect and transmit information. There are a whole set of restrictions on how long you can keep data, who you can share it with if you collect it. And these rules have only been strengthened. There's a new law that is just coming into effect right now, which is going to even upgrade these privacy rules even further. And so on balance, the two systems have a friction because they want to share information. The governments want to share information to fight terrorism, but at the same time, there's a set of differences in legal regimes that create a whole set of impediments to that process. And that creates, in my mind, the overarching difficulty in the transatlantic relationship on counterterrorism right now is that on the one hand, you have security communities that see information as power, but on the other hand, you have civil liberties communities that see information as a right, a basic part of liberty that needs to be defended. Okay, so first, information is power. Second, that power is facing a lot of tension because of these two different regimes. The third point I want to make is that I want to dispel everybody of the idea that it is an us versus them conflict. So there was Kagan, he had this book that said, what is it? US is from Mars, Europe is from Venus. It was called A Paradise and Power, I think is the name of the book. And there he said, Europe loves human rights and they love civil liberties, and the US just loves to kill the terrorists and will do anything they can to kill the terrorists. And this sets it up as a systems clash. And there is a conflict of rules that I just described about the way privacy is regulated in these two societies. But in fact, in the two societies, there are groups that want the exact same thing. In my mind, there is a security community that is transatlantic. It is composed of Homeland Security officials as well as the intelligence agencies. And it has counterparts in Europe who often sit in what they call interior ministries. And they really want the same thing, which is to get access to that information, which gives them power and gives them new tools to respond to transatlantic and also domestic terrorist threats. On the other side, there are a set of civil liberties organizations. You might think of the ACLU in the United States. There's a bunch that are very specific to privacy and surveillance tasks. The EFF, EPIC is another one. And they have relationships to civil liberties organizations in Europe who have ones called State Watch. There are also these public officials, these regulators I mentioned, and they're trying to guarantee that the European system of privacy rules does not get torn down by the surveillance state. So this battle between the surveillance community and the civil liberties community, which I see as a transatlantic struggle between these two communities. It's not us versus them, but it's the two communities using the transatlantic relations to battle each other, have engaged in a series of very specific policy moves in which the security community, in my mind, has been very successful. One of them was about airline passenger data, sharing of airline passenger data between the US and Europe. And the other one was around financial data. The data, there's this organization called SWIFT, which sits in Belgium, and the US and Europe agreed to share information that this organization collects, which basically gives the US and Europe access to information of all bank account transactions over $10,000 that happen globally. So the surveillance community was very successful at getting these two agreements, and what they did was they used the transatlantic relations to undermine checks that were happening at the domestic level. So in the United States, there is a terrorist watch list for flights, for aviation. But actually, the US tried to upgrade it, to make it more expansive. There was something called CAPS 2. There was another project called Total Information Awareness. They had these great buzzwords. But these things were actually killed by domestic civil liberties communities that prevented them. In the European side, there was also an effort to expand domestic rules that were for a long time blocked. And so what the US and Europe did was they created this transatlantic agreement, which in many ways circumvented those domestic barriers. They shared information with each other that they couldn't get from their own domestic systems. And the same thing happened with the SWIFT agreement, where the US got this information from Europe that the Europeans actually were not legally allowed to access domestically because of privacy rules. And that agreement, that transatlantic agreement, says there's a reciprocity clause. And that reciprocity clause allows European security community to ask the US security community to access the European data that they weren't allowed to access domestically through Europe. So these are just examples of how the transatlantic interaction opens up new possibilities in terms of surveillance than were previously possible. My fourth and last point is just to signal that the blurring of security and commercial interests that exists today in the United States, but also in Europe, has made this security push more vulnerable and on a more shaky ground. So information is power, the two privacy regimes create conflict, they're using this transatlantic space to expand security. The last point is that the very foundation of this transatlantic counterterrorism effort, which relies on the sharing of commercial data with the security community, is under threat. And that is because a set of actors within Europe, the civil liberties actors, have used the European Court of Justice in order to undermine these data flows. And so there was a decision, it was about a year ago, in where the European Court of Justice ruled that the sharing of information between the US and Europe was not constitutional under the European rule. It required a renegotiation of the US-European agreements. There's something now that's called the Privacy Shield, which is a new agreement. It has a great acronym. They all have these great acronyms. And that thing is supposed to facilitate the commercial sharing of data, which without bleeding it over into the security community. Because basically the European privacy rule says you can share data, but you can't use it for a different purpose. Google can transfer their data to Google, but then the US government is not allowed to access that data. The problem is that assurance is very unstable. And there's a new court case that's being brought which says that this privacy shield does not fully fulfill these constitutional requirements. And it's basically up to the European Court of Justice, which will decide whether that is sufficient or not. But I want to kind of leave you with a sense that even though information is power, there is this ongoing struggle within the European and US populations about how much surveillance should be allowed and how much privacy should be allowed. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Aben. Thank you all very much for coming out, and particular thanks to the Grad Student Council. This is the sort of thing we should be doing a lot, and we tend to do it a little, so I'm glad you moved forward on this. I'll talk about transatlantic cooperation on counterterrorism, but the bottom line, and I think the most important sentence I want to tell you is, this is a good news story. I'm mainly going to talk about problems, but you should take this away as, these are the problems, good friends have. Right? And that in general, there's been a lot of success, especially in the post 9/11 era. Let me begin by saying the scope of the problem is dramatically different. Right? So if you look at the foreign fighter flow to Iraq and Syria as one example, Europeans probably 5,000 to 6,000 went. In the United States, we use somewhat odd figures, but let's say 100 max. 12 have returned to the United States. 1,200 have returned to Europe. Right? So there's just an entirely different scale of problem that different countries are facing. Right? So the U.S. problem is smaller than Belgium's, right? And we have slightly more resources than Belgium, right? So there's a dramatically different sort of issue going on. But conversely, the United States is globally involved. Right? I don't think Belgium is staying up at night saying, what should our policy be in Afghanistan? Right? They might be talking about their contribution to NATO, their contribution in a broader Western sense, but they're not thinking about how they're going to lead the world on particular foreign policy issues, the way people in the White House or the Pentagon tend to think in those terms. So a good news story, but let me start by talking about some differences. One, as Professor Newman talked about, was data privacy, and he knows a million times more than I ever will on this, so I'll just leave it as saying this remains an issue for cooperation. There are questions about what to do with suspected terrorists. So one historical issue has been the U.S. preference for the death penalty for some people. And that's made it harder for some of the European states to formally provide cooperation because their own laws prohibit that sort of penalty. The Europeans tend to do more in de-radicalization. The United States occasionally has a conference on this issue, but it doesn't take this seriously. A number of European states have put in fairly serious de-radicalization programs and have actually stepped them up in recent years in a way that as I go into a bit, differs from one another, but nevertheless is something that is quite different from the U.S. side. But a big one is that this is a real shift for, I'll say, power and intelligence when you think about who the primary actors are. So in the European side, a lot of the key actors are domestic intelligence services and at times domestic police services. And that's what you'd expect. These are domestic problems for the most part, right? France, the United Kingdom, and so on. These are their own populations that they're most worried about. When you think about intelligence cooperation, in the kind of non-terrorism world, almost all intelligence cooperation is between external services, right? So the partner of the CIA is MI6, right? It's not MI5, right? It's not the domestic intelligence service. And you could go around Europe and say the same thing, right? That it's, you know, the DGSA in France, right? It's the external service. But the key partner here tend to be the internal services, right? And so there's an entirely new set of liaison relationships that often have to be developed. And then you have to go down to police levels, things that historically have not been strengths for the CIA. And the FBI is still relatively new at this, right? There are FBI liaison teams and so on, and legal attaches, and there's a host of these things. But in general, this is something that hasn't been their strong suit, right? Foreign affairs is not what most FBI officers train in, right? And then at times, this is really a police matter, right? And in case you wonder, the NYPD does have an external service, right? So there are NYPD reps abroad, but that's relatively unusual. And for the most part, when you're dealing with police, you tend to have intelligence services dealing with police. And so there are cultural clashes, there are data clashes, there are broader procedural clashes. There are a couple European states that do things externally that are relevant for counterterrorism, right? So I'll single out the United Kingdom and France, right? They actually have militaries. They, in general, collect intelligence abroad and use that intelligence fairly aggressively. So there is that sort of traditional relationship that does happen, whether it's the French operating in Africa, a number of states operating against the Islamic State. But again, for the most part, these are domestic services, internal services. The much bigger differences and the problems often for the United States is that there are bigger differences within Europe on this than there are between the median point in Europe and the United States, right? So in many issues, the United States is kind of in the middle compared to where Europe is, right? So in France, historically, you've had almost an extreme security state approach to counterterrorism, right? So they've done mass arrests, they do identity card checks that, you know, happen to entirely involve Muslims. Torture is fairly widespread, right? They do lots of things that are extremely aggressive. They're very, very, I'll say, energetic in investigations, right? Mosques are surveilled as a matter of course, right? I mean, it's really kind of one extreme, right? And then historically, you know, when I talk to kind of Danish counterterrorism folks, their approach for the most part seemed to be to surround suspects with kind of very tall, attractive intelligence officers, right? And just like have them kind of accept that reality. And it was, you know, really markedly different. And then you have Germany, which has a very decentralized political system where a lot of the action is done at the state level. Italy seems to do this somewhat successfully, but as far as I can tell, there are several hundred different systems within Italy, but nevertheless seem to work reasonably well. I never could quite understand it. So there's a lot of variation within Europe. And the United States is often on kind of the midpoint of some of these issues. And so one question that comes up right now is, I mentioned the European states have this huge foreign fighter issue. Do you want your people back or not? Right? And most European states almost say openly we don't. Right? Ideally, we'd have them killed. Next to ideally, that we would have the Iraqis, you know, disappear them in a jail, or the Kurds disappear them. Many of them are deliberately not working with the Kurds or others who hold their people. They're saying, well, they can't recognize you because you're a non-state group, so you might just have to, you know, kill those people, right? And so there's a real reluctance to engage on this issue with some states, while others have the more, I will say, stereotypical view of Europe as very concerned about human rights, wanting their people back for a fair trial. So again, a lot of variation within Europe. And this has gone over into military operations, where a number of states have said the biggest danger, counterterrorism danger we face in Iraq and Syria is our people in Iraq and Syria. So when we're talking about fighting the Islamic State, the people we want most dead are our people in the Islamic State, right? So they've kind of made an effort to specifically target those people, while others have said, these are our citizens and they haven't been tried, right? So we want to bring them back for trial, but we're not gonna execute them more, right? So there's a real difference there. What makes this a bit more complex is there's some co-location going on. So the Islamic State often organized its European units by language, right? So the Belgians and the French were put together, right? But the Belgian goal was kind of, can we bring these people back? While the French goal was, can we kill them, right? And so the French are killing Belgian citizens because they're co-located, right? So how do they're still kind of wrestling with that question. There is a question the Europeans are facing about what to do about children, right? There are different numbers you hear, but roughly 1,000 or so children. There are kind of European citizens who are children who are part of the Islamic State. Some of those are people who went over as children, brought by their families. Some are people who, people have been in this war zone for 4 years, 5 years in some cases, people have babies, right? So what do you do about these, right? Do you say, oh my gosh, these are going to be a huge threat, right? They were kind of raised in hell by evil people, 20 years down the road, these are going to be blowing people up. Or do you say, these are the victims within the victim community, right? These are truly innocent, and they've suffered the most. We need to help them tremendously, right? As you could tell, I'm kind of on side number 2. But there's a real debate within Europe about what to do with these people, how much citizenship rights to grant them, what sort of programs do you want in place. Again, for many of these issues, the United States has the luxury of small numbers, right? Very few Americans have gone over. For the most part, we don't have to deal with a lot of these very difficult tensions and issues. What makes us even tougher from the European point of view is, of course, there is something called Europe, right? While usually intelligence cooperation is kind of the last vestige of the nation state, right? That's just not something that's usually done on a broad multilateral level. But that said, if you let someone back into Germany, you're letting them back in within the common borders of the European Union, right? So what one state does affects every other state. So states are very concerned about kind of a lowest common denominator effect of what a neighbor might do with its policies. And this is something that has caused a lot of tension within security circles within Europe. One thing that has changed things, and in my view improved things, is actually the United Nations. There was a UN resolution 2178 passed a couple years ago that required certain efforts against, in particular, foreign fighters, but among others. And that forced a number of European states to update their laws. And so you had more harmonization of laws. And that's kind of my broader recommendation to Europe with the capital, with the big E, is that you want some degree of harmonization. Right? This kind of incredible variation is interesting for people like Abe and me to study, right? Because we get to study variation. But it's not particularly good from a counterterrorism point of view. The last thing I'll say that is a commonality, it has nothing to do with cooperation, but I just want to throw it out there, which is I usually would say terrorism rarely has a strategic effect, right? That for the most part, terrorism in the United States has been a strategic nuisance, right? And that's why 9/11 was so dramatic. It had truly strategic effects. But in the post-9/11 era in the United States, roughly 100 people have died, incredibly small number by what we feared, right? It's 100 too many, but far fewer than most people expected, right? And almost half of those were from one particular attack on a gay nightclub in Orlando, which was more crazy guy than highly trained terrorist who, had spent years in training camps and was, pushed by foreign groups, right? So really, from a U.S. Homeland point of view, a significantly smaller problem than the pre-9/11 era. Having said that, it's become a strategic issue in the United States, and I would say especially Europe, because of its impact on politics, right? Where it's changed the nature of how we talk about security, it's changed the nature of how we talk about migration, right? So I think the kind of incredible anti-Muslim bigotry has really affected dynamics within this country, and I would say that's on steroids in a number of European countries. Right? And a lot of counterterrorism success depends on community cooperation, right? And part of that is you don't want communities to join nasty groups, but part of it is you want the community to, the unpleasant word is inform on their members, but I don't like that word because I think of it as like, would I inform on a child molester in my neighborhood? Right? Yes, I would, right? I would call the police, right? That's what you want people to look at the terrorists within their own community as incredibly dangerous and be sharing that with law enforcement. But when you have this hostility, you're not going to have the communities trust law enforcement. And this has been something that terrorism makes dramatically worse. And I'm not sure it was an intended impact of the terrorist attacks, but it certainly has been a real impact. And that's something we see on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that even though the number of terrorist attacks has not been huge in some cases, the dynamic has been present. So let me stop there, and I think we'll probably sit to take questions. Is that right? Yeah. So we'll sit to take questions.
Who's got a question for one of our two speakers?
Hi, this is a question for you, Dr. Byman. It's about the point that you made about the de-radicalization programs that are a lot bigger in Europe, and the point you made about the children that have been involved in the Islamic State. Do you see the de-radicalization programs that have been put in place as being beneficial for helping those communities try and reintegrate or de-radicalize from what they've experienced in their youth?
So the children issue is a really new one, right? And that's because previous kind of foreign fighter flows really didn't produce this sort of, part of it was just a numbers game, but part of it was previous foreign fighter flows were often about going and joining the war. And this one was often about going and joining a state and living the life of a good Muslim in a state that happens to be at war, right? So I could go fight and my spouse and kids could lead the lives as true Muslims. So it's a new problem. And then the Caliphate was doing pretty well even 2.5 years ago, right? So it's a new problem that people have to leave the Caliphate. So from an evaluation point of view, it's really early to tell, right? What I would say though is, at the very least, you want programs in place. You want to monitor, you want to check this. The de-radicalization programs in general, as I suspect you know, have a very spotty history, right? So the British programs, which when they were initially announced, I actually thought they were kind of well designed. It turned out they were somewhat disastrous. For those of you who don't know, they're kind of early on, the intention was we're going to work with high-risk communities, high-risk Muslim communities, and to try to move people away from terrorism, which kind of sounded good as a PowerPoint slide. But what it ended up being was basically going into Muslim communities and saying, hey, I think all of you might be terrorists, but I want to stop you from being a terrorist. So can you terrorists come work with me? And together we can go after other terrorists, right? It was just a way of really angering a community and putting them, making them be seen as kind of separate. Brits have gotten better, right? A number of other states have learned. Again, we're seeing a lot of different programs in a lot of different areas. I think we'll learn kind of what works better and what doesn't. I particularly like the programs that are focusing on prisons because I think that's a fairly well-known high-risk community. And in any event, they're violent people, even if they're not necessarily prone to terrorism. So you want some form of counseling and monitoring afterward as well. So I think it's a bit too early to tell. It's a very long way of saying. But I think there's a lot going on that hopefully we'll know more in a few years about that question.
This question is addressed generally to both of you, and I think that it may apply to both of your subjects. During the Munich Security Conference, it was made pretty clear that there's a growing rift between a lot of the European states and the U.S. policy-wise. And I want to know, both with terrorism and security issues generally, does that apply at some of the lower bureaucratic levels, or is there still increasing cooperation happening, or are we starting to see a rift between the two sides?
So I think that there's a lot of, let's say, problematic dynamics that are happening right now. I mean, obviously on the day-to-day information sharing in the kind of agreements that I was talking about, it's still happening. I think that there are, on the one hand, there are a set of political problems that are happening. One is that it is becoming increasingly difficult for European leaders to support cooperation with the United States because of the current administration with their own populations. So if you look at the popularity of the United States, these Pew polls, it's a shift from 60 to 70% of European populations support U.S. Maybe at the lower end, maybe it's 45. but some of the countries that were at the 60 to 70 are now in the 45. And so that just means the majority of their populations do not support, the United States right now, and so then it becomes a political win for, in the domestic political arena, to oppose cooperation with the United States. And you see a whole bunch of kind of political parties doing that. They're putting pressure on their current governments, or the current governments are taking that position because it looks politically beneficial in their home, electoral situation to do that. You also, at the same time, I'd say you have a lack of leadership within a lot of the agencies on the US side that are cooperating with their European counterparts. I mean, if you just look at any of the agencies the United States has that deal with international affairs and with Europe, the lack of the senior leadership tier that a lot of European governments are kind of questioning, well, who should I talk to? Which was always the, that's what the US always said about Europe. But right now, that is not clear. And so I think that is breaking down cooperation. And then the third one, which came out very clearly at the Munich Security Conference, was what role does the president play in communicating the U.S. administration strategy, or even its just kind of operational goals right now. And the ridiculous argument was that you should just ignore what he says and you should just listen to my reassurance. But I find that if I'm a European leader, that seems completely uncredible to believe that I should not listen to the President of the United States, but I should listen to some third underling tell me that this is what's happening. So I think all three of those dynamics, the political, electoral dynamic, the bureaucratic kind of cooperative dynamic, but also that there's just how long can diplomacy give the United States breathing room for having an erratic communicative structure?
I have a question also for both of you about, suggestions, assertions that especially Germany has repeatedly been making in the recent years about matching military cooperation and spending with development contributions and aid. And knowing that, especially with regards to migration, but also the links to terrorism, that they see that as their contribution in a way. How does the U.S. receive those suggestions? Are they at all taken seriously, or is this Germany's way of essentially putting themselves on the moral high road a little bit? I'd just be curious to hear your opinions on that.
Sure. I mean, I think the defense minister, she did this at the Munich Security Conference, and I thought it was like like in a rhetorical strategy, it's a very effective strategy to say, we're ponying up, we're just ponying up on these other things which are really important for terrorism. I'm not really sure that the U.S. administration cares about that argument, because this comes back to the question of what is the U.S. administration? And that is very difficult at this moment to know. Secretary Mattis certainly cares about that. He believes that diplomacy and development and all of those things are important for U.S. national interests. And he said, if you don't do these things, I'm going to need more boots on the ground. So he understands this position. But the president is very focused on what I would call transactional relations, which is I'm giving you this much money in security, you need to give me this back. Just the clearest example of this is his interaction with South Korea. In the relationship with South Korea, he's like, I'm in this security relationship with you. I want to, make sure that North Korea doesn't have anything. At the same time, I'm going to question our trade agreement. That's totally right out. I hate that thing. Okay, so his ability to see these things as interacting is very limited, and I would say that to think that the German idea that development assistance should be counted against Trump's argument about NATO, I don't think the president's going to be persuaded by that. But I think in the court of public opinion, and it can be effective.
I'll add that much of the counterterrorism community is skeptical of the helping with development helps with terrorism argument. There's a lot of the evidence points kind of against that, actually, not just not proving it, but that for the most part terrorism tends to be the realm of the more educated and more prosperous. Right? There's a lot of variation on this, but it's not that development is inherently a positive. And in fact, the development you want from a counterterrorism point of view tends to be state structures. So often you want to build the coercive structure of a state from a counterterrorism point of view, which is often, in my view, bad for long-term political development in many ways, but nevertheless has short-term benefits. I would say on the particular question of Germany, I would say the reaction is actually much more negative, I think, than many people understand. You have to get the mindset that allowing foreign Muslims into your country is a bad thing, right? So what Germany did was allowed hundreds of thousands of enemies into Europe. And therefore, why should they be thanked for that, right? They're creating a huge problem that has spillover effects, right? And as you could tell from my remarks, I pretty strongly disagree with that. But that mindset is very strong among some senior elements of the Trump administration, right? So a permissive migration policy is not doing the world a favor. It's posing a threat, right? What you want is a bigger barrier.
So both of you have spoken quite a bit about surveillance, intelligence sharing, and I think a lot of that gets to the find, maybe fix, exploit, and assess phases of the targeting cycle. I'd like to look at the finish phase a little bit more closely and talk about some of the counterterrorism operations I've been involved in. I've found that it gets really dicey when you start targeting American citizens who are participating in terrorist operations, and I'm wondering how that affects European militaries or intelligence services who are trying to finish terrorists that they've identified who are citizens of their own countries, and whether that affects cooperation between Europe and the United States.
To my knowledge, it does affect cooperation that there are rooms where people sit and discuss targeting, right? So people have different views on what can be hit, and this is a classic military alliance problem. So to go back before your time, there were raids canceled in the Bosnian wars because the Dutch government was afraid that a Van Gogh might be damaged in a nearby museum, right? And you wanted to keep him in the coalition, right? I mean, that was a strategic question for a general to deal with, even though he was probably secretly exploding as he dealt with that, right? So there is that question. It gets a little hard because some European states don't play by the rules they enunciate, right? So France has a kind of long tradition of working really hard on rules that it then proceeds to ignore immediately in practice, right? And so you'll have these kind of elaborate discussions, right? And then they'll be like, yeah, but we just decided to kill him, right? While other states are much more legalistic and much more bound by this. The US is actually somewhat, I'll say, ambivalent on this issue, right? So the US very famously killed Anwar al-Awlaki, but went through kind of elaborate legal gymnastics to do so, right? And did so for reasons that most people don't focus on. He was a very famous propagandist, but they made it clear they didn't kill him because he was a propagandist. They killed him because he was involved in this relatively minor operation. Well, he's an operator, right? So it had nothing to do with his free speech as an American citizen, right? It was operation. For those who are interested, the judge's ruling in that case is fascinating because he points out it's actually easier to kill an American citizen than it is to eavesdrop on him, right? That you actually need court permission to do eavesdropping in a way you don't for killing someone. This is something relatively new for most European states, right? So their military doctrine, their legal structures haven't caught up to this question of killing their own citizens in a war zone, on the other side. So my sense is that there's a lot of it kind of being decided by small numbers of people without the broader discussion I think most states, including the United States, should be having. But I might be off on that. I mean, this might be missing part of the dialogue. Do you have a different sense?
I don't have any insight into that question.
I was curious if you both could see kind of the role of non-governmental actors, specifically in terms of private companies, and also kind of we're seeing Facebook, for example, kind of ramping up their CD efforts and also kind of monitoring hate speech. And kind of do you see an increased role in these kind of third-party actors in this space, especially as a lot of kind of terrorist networks are infiltrating this social media space and using it to really kind of garner support?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's the two sides of that, of the how terrorism intersects with new media. And I mean, I think as I tried to stress in my talk is that in the old world, governments collected data, which then they tried to use to do whatever their operation was, whether it was like, make welfare services more efficient, go after bad guys, whatever it is. But in our current world, governments rely on third parties, mostly private actors, to get most of the data that they're using to then get the bad guys. And so that creates a whole set of just complicated interactions about, do you inform the private actors that you're doing this, the third parties? So that was part of the Edward Snowden revelations, was that the US government was accessing private sector data troves without, at least the companies said they didn't know. I mean, they of course had to know, because like they're the most sophisticated computer companies in the world, and we just don't realize that the NSA has a backdoor into everything that we do, and I mean, come on, it's like crap. But they said that they without knowledge knew that, and now there's this case right now between Microsoft and Ireland, which is going to be decided, any day, which will be fascinating, which is basically, does Microsoft have to turn over data to the US government, even if the data is housed in another country? And all these kinds of questions just show you how complicated it is for these surveillance exercises to happen when the government is mostly relying on third-party data, and those third parties are increasingly finding that is a consumer detriment. The whole kind of Apple's decision to encrypt the phones after a set of terrorist attacks, and then what happened in the San Bernardino terrorist attack, where then some company based in Israel decided to de-encrypt the phone. I mean, all this kind of stuff, it's like, but that is the world we live in, where there are these consumers who want one thing, governments who want a third thing, and then the companies sit in the middle. The flip side of your question, I think, is a very important question, which is how technologies that we thought of as democratizing and as channels for free speech and liberty are being used for nefarious ends. And that is whether we know that terrorist organizations have very successfully used these platforms to radicalize groups in far-off countries, and it's the main way they do it. And it's also being used for disinformation strategies, and this isn't just terrorist organizations, but the whole, what's happening right now in the United States is a clear example of that. And so I think there has to be a set of basic rules put in place, at least in the United States, about what can happen in the information society. Because right now, and that is a conversation that's much more advanced in Europe. They, like at the European Union, they have a directorate, a commissioner that's dedicated to the information society. In the United States, we basically left that up to be a laissez-faire kind of activity. And we've passed laws even very similar to the gun laws that say the companies aren't liable. They can't charge liable for these things. So you have a setting where we have no recourse. What do we do when there's a terrorist organization using a Facebook platform to spread its hate? It's protected by free speech in many ways, unless it's actually, you can prove that they're delivering funds or directly inciting violence.
I'll add briefly, the companies have a lot of latitude. So in 2013, they were they were talking about the First Amendment and being very resistant to government pressure. When the Islamic State came out with a lot of beheading videos, and then especially with some of the right-wing violence, all of a sudden they discovered their terms of service were surprisingly restrictive, right? So they weren't responding to the government, but they were just throwing people off right and left based on their own terms of service, right? And this creates a whole different set of issue, right? So I don't know if you followed the Daily Stormer GoDaddy issue, where the web hosting site just basically said he doesn't really like white supremacists, so he threw a white supremacist magazine off his site. And then he wrote about it and said, I woke up and felt like they didn't belong, so I threw them off. I shouldn't have that power, right? That's a real remarkable source of power for an individual to have, to be able to fundamentally change the discourse in the United States. And so I agree with Abe that our solution to kind of letting the private sector handle this one doesn't work too well, in that I think it produces some extreme outcomes, right? You can have a case where, they're just very resistant to, in my opinion, fairly basic counterterrorism requests. Or the opposite, which is that they're just so afraid of any controversy that they really reduce a lot of speech, even stuff that, while I might dislike myself, is, I think, quite legitimate.
Dr. Newman, I would be interested what kind of security implications you see with the General Data Protection Regulation that's coming up. I think you briefly touched on it. And if there are any, how they are perceived or mitigated by the US.
So I think that, so there's this new regulation for privacy. I think it's still a little bit unclear what is going to be, what's going to happen. But the most important thing for the surveillance community will be how companies reorganize their basically server farms and where they hold the data. And so there is a potential that a lot of these companies will try to quarantine their servers in the countries, in European member states, in order to prevent having to comply with cumbersome regulations about transferring data outside of Europe. And if that happens, the reason why the United States NSA was able to access so much stuff is because most of the server farms that everybody uses are in Virginia and in Arizona and in Washington. And so everybody, whether it was a European company or not, was housing their data in these American sites, and then the NSA just put a clamp on the hose that went in and was like, okay, let's all go through it. So if it restructures how people organize basically how they store their data, it will have serious consequences for the privileged position that the United States has had, because we've always been able to say, well, if you want to use these facilities, then they're a US territory and we're going to claim access to them.
What explains the disproportionate greater number of foreign fighters that originate in Europe compared to the US?
We have a couple answers. So one is that there's a larger population, first of all, and that population historically has been less integrated. So in the United States, if you're an American Muslim, you are on average likely to be better educated and wealthier than a non-Muslim in the United States. Right? Extremely successful. That is significantly less true. Right? So one is there's an integration question. Two, because of the nature of European citizenship and how people were brought in as workers, many people were brought in with significant ties to their homeland, with the expectation that they would be going back to their homeland. So the kind of traditional American 19th century, you're getting on the boat to America, you're never going to see your home again, right? There's something of a legacy of that in the United States, while in Europe there's still an expectation of that back and forth. Some of the communities were involved in civil wars in their own country. So in the 1990s, the Algerian population in France was fundraising and logistics hub for the Algerian Civil War. So you have these existing networks that happened before the foreign fighter flows began, but have mobilized people in these communities. You have a fairly significant number of, I don't know what the quite proper word is, I'm going to use the word extremist, but people debate the word, which is extremist nonviolent organizations in Europe that are Islamists. So you have Sharia for Belgium, in the UK you had Al-Muhajirun, and you had Tablighi Jamaat. Almost every major European state has a significant organization like this that has teachings that are fairly radical and large memberships, even though they're not preaching violence. One of the biggest indicators of whether someone is a foreign fighter or not is whether they went through one of those organizations. Right? You have a significantly higher chance of becoming a foreign fighter if you did, and that's just not present in the United States, right? At least I can't name a major American Muslim organization calling for Sharia law in the United States, right? Peacefully, right? It'd be perfectly reasonable, a free speech issue if they did, right? But that's just not there. So I would say those are some of the main issues, and then you have a kind of path dependence issue where you have veterans and individuals who have been involved in mobilizing for previous conflicts, then set the stage the next time around. So when Syria begins in 2011, 2012, you have a significant number of people who had experience in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bosnia, who are often first movers for getting the wheel turning for Syria. And that's just dramatically less so in the United States. And one of my biggest worries about the Syrian mobilization is, given that that's an exponentially larger number than any other conflict in modern times in terms of foreign volunteers, that will create an even bigger problem in the future. That 10 years down the road, there's a conflict in Morocco, and you'll have a lot of people with a Syria background who are able to access international networks and know how to mobilize that will enable the foreign fighter flows to happen much more quickly.
Kind of with technology and increases usage in spying and things like that, I was curious if you could talk a bit about the EU's current push to expand its export control regimes of dual-use technologies. I know there's kind of a lot of positives and negatives that comes with something like that. Kind of, if the U.S. would look into that as part of the CFIUS changes as well, if you could talk.
Well, I mean, I think in my mind, the dual-use conversations are more focused on China and other kind of state threats of other, than it is necessarily about counterterrorism. But it is a big conversation, and it's one that the United States is also thinking about as well. The CFIUS process, I think in some ways, so the CFIUS process is about foreign acquisition of foreign direct investment, and these are things that are all related, and they're all related to globalization, that basically what happens when you have a Chinese company that is really a state-owned enterprise, that it starts to purchase AI firms in Europe and the United States. And how should we think about that? And that is a pressing question, which I think, I'm not really sure that the administration is thinking about in like, yes, they're thinking about like, should we block specific deals? But how do we think about a world where state and private sector interests are combined and they're using technology and the monopolization of technology in order to do that? I think that Europe in some ways is behind in that they don't have a CFIUS counterpart. They're creating one. It's very difficult. It has to be transnational. It's very young. It's not as organized. And so you saw one of the last acts that Obama did was he blocked the Chinese purchase of a German semiconductor firm. So why does the United States president block this semiconductor purchase? Well, 2 weeks before he was in Berlin, and Merkel's like, hey, by the way, on your way out, could you help me out here? So I think that this is a place where there needs to be more conversation about how do we think about things like AI as a dual-use technology, because it's going to be. Has anybody seen those robot videos? It's like, God, it's freaking me out here. But like, if you don't think that like what Google is doing with AI is part of that, then you're crazy. Like those things go together, and then all of a sudden those things become very dual use. So I think it's an important conversation. I don't really think that the administration in the United States is thinking forwardly about like what are the next 50-year technology threats and how are we addressing them right now.
I do have a question. I was wondering, what is your experience with the US and Europeans working with third countries, especially banking off of bilateral cooperation, for example, Spain with Morocco or the US with Egypt or something like that? Do you think that there could be a broader like lessons learned, maybe cooperation among all these entities to improve this transatlantic cooperation?
I would say, I'll answer your question in a second because I want to apologize. I missed a key factor in answering your question, and I was embarrassed when I stopped talking. The other factor that affects the number of foreign fighter flows, which is tremendously important, it's really easy to get from Europe to Syria. Right? You drive to Turkey and you walk across the border. It's a lot harder in the United States, and that's a really boring variable, but it's really, really important, right? And once Turkey closed the border, everything changes. Okay, going back to your question. One of the big value addeds of the United States is it has a global intelligence operation. And what that means is not just in the sense of, there might be an American spy in country X or Y, but really we have cooperative relationships with all around the world. So if you think about a terrorism plot, you think about 9/11. right? So what is 9/11? It's some people in Germany who want to go to Chechnya, who end up in Afghanistan and Pakistan, who are funded by people in the United Arab Emirates, who have key meetings in Malaysia and Spain, and then go to the United States, right? So ideally, you would have all those governments working together, right? And now they are, right? But they're working together bilateral. Oh, I shouldn't say that. It's a hub and spoke system, right? Where they're all working with the United States. And the United States might say, Spain, there's going to be some people meeting that we care about because we found it out from the Moroccans, right? Can you monitor them? The Spaniards will monitor them, and they'll say, hey, we found this phone with a number of the United Arab Emirates. We call it the United Arab Emirates. Intelligence agencies tend to hate large numbers of actors, right? They like things that are bilateral. From their point of view, they're trying to manage attention between information and being kind of received and information getting out to too many people. They believe if it's widely disseminated, it will leak and thus be less useful. So they always prefer bilateral. At times, in my view, too much. But in general, I think that preference will continue. But that is a major source of transatlantic cooperation, is that the United States can bring things to the table that the European states themselves can operate. You can say that, you know, here are individuals in a country you care about, and we can access them. And part of that is this intelligence cooperation. Part of it is also signals intelligence, which is extensive and much more comprehensive from the United States than it is. Some European states are quite good at this actually, but they tend to be more limited.
I had a question for Dr. Byman. In terms of the effects of terrorism and migration issues on the politics of the United States and Europe, I was wondering if you might be willing to share some things that you would like to see done that might move the discourse in a more productive direction.
Yeah, I would have given you a good answer to that 10 years ago, and people tried and it didn't work, right? So I would have said, you know, look, actual numbers are actually pretty low from terrorism. Why don't we have an intelligent discussion about that? You don't need to be so afraid, folks, right? And people will learn, right? That didn't really happen. Terrorism numbers kept falling. They kind of rose again a little bit with the Islamic State, but in general kept falling. People didn't learn. It became a very good political issue to beat up other people. And so it's very hard to talk people back from that. The numbers, people just have a false sense of the numbers and the dangers involved. And it has mixed with a broader, I'll say, anti-migration, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiment in all these countries. So there's kind of, you know, refugees equal terrorists, equal migrants, right? And they are all seen as going together. The figures are almost never zero, though, right? So it's not like I could say to someone, if you, you know, let's take the, you know, Jared Kushner bowl of Skittles analogy, right? The kind of, you know, if you remember his thing during the campaign of, you know, if a couple of these were poisoned, would you grab a handful, you know, with the thing of Skittles, right? That was his view on migrants, right? I would imagine like a room full of Skittles here, okay? Like the whole room. And maybe one of them is poisoned, right? That when you let people into a country, some of them will be bad actors, right? And some could be terrorists, more likely they're going to be a criminal of some sort, right? And that's just because they're human beings, right? You know, they're going to be bad actors. And I haven't seen a way to improve discourse on this. And a number of politicians tried in different ways. President Bush tried in certain ways. President Obama tried in other ways. Neither one succeeded. And President Trump is making the problem worse. Yes?
I'm based in so my question is related to the involvement of terrorism since the 9/11 attacks. I'd be interested to hear your opinion how the Transatlantic cooperation has shifted or changed or adapted to changing threats. I mean, in the beginning, it was mainly terrorist networks who really worked together. I mean, you just described the fact that they were in different countries yet working on the same project. Then we had this, you know, small groups, but they were independent yet still connected. And then we had these lone wolves. So how did transatlantic cooperation adapt to the change of threat and effective way to counter it?
So there's a puzzle I'm very interested in, which is that in Europe in particular, if you go back 15 years, you'd say probably 80% of those involved in jihadist-style terrorism had a foreign fighter, a foreign conflict link, and now it's probably about 20%. So it's a dramatic shift. And I think a lot of that is because of better counterterrorism cooperation, right? Some of that's transatlantic, some of that's with the Middle East, but a lot of that is, the foreign fighter flow issue to me is a very dangerous one, but it's one it's very disruptible. There are a lot of kind of access points to that flow that you can disrupt. It's much harder to disrupt the US jargon would be homegrown violent extremists. Right? That's a much harder thing to disrupt. And often it's individuals and so on that are kind of acting on their own, or with only limited guidance via social media from a group like the Islamic State. So I think transatlantic cooperation can help by keeping the foreign fighters limited. That's a real contribution. There is a question of what you do with propagandists, right? And one answer, U.S. answer is, well, we tried counter narratives and counter messaging, and we didn't do that too well, but killing them worked pretty well, and blowing up transmission stations worked pretty well, and okay, right? Part of it is what was discussed earlier of what you ask of media companies and how you want them to engage on this issue. But I see this more as a domestic issue and less as a transatlantic issue. But that's in part because the transatlantic stuff has had a lot of success in my view, and that should be recognized. The other thing I'll add that has come up is the retiring director of the National Counterterrorism Center said U.S. gun laws are a problem from a counterterrorism point of view in the United States, and noted his European counterpart said, oh my God, if we had American gun laws, right? We have these stabbings on a regular basis where one person might die and a couple are injured, right? If it were an American gun law situation, we would have a lot more mass shootings in Europe. So it's an interesting question about that being seen perhaps as a European success in some ways.
And I would just say that I think that the community that I was kind of talking about, and this is also kind of what Dan talked about how terrorism has altered the political dynamics for political actors on both sides of the Atlantic. They have continued to use the threat of terrorism in order to maximize their, what I would call their bureaucratic objectives. So, even though the focus has now shifted more towards homegrown counterterrorism efforts, the cooperation is really focused on expanding surveillance technologies and surveillance capacities that aren't usually homegrown focused, but it just expands the interior ministries in Europe, their capacity to get access to data that they might use in a whole range of circumstances. And so I think the terrorism conversation at the transatlantic level allows European interior ministries more latitude to suppress civil liberties and expand their surveillance state, regardless of how the actual threat is evolving.
If realized, and this is a really big if, what role do you foresee European defense cooperation, whether that be PESCO, CSDP, Macron's European Intervention Initiative, playing in counterterrorism?
I don't know. I don't really know. Those things are so speculative of what they're really going to be and what they're going to do. So, I mean, on the one hand, Europe has a history of doing defense cooperation in kind of alternative venues, and like humanitarian intervention or crisis response, these areas that are not like your traditional, we need a lot of tanks and we need helicopters that will fly people places. And so in that way you could say maybe counterterrorism is like the perfect thing for them to get involved in because of that. But at the same time, I think that, Dan can probably speak more to this, is that you need a lot of expertise to be involved in an effective counterterrorism strategy. And all of these European projects are like 10 parties, each has like, I give my computer, you give your room. Would that really be an effective platform for dealing with this kind of problem that you need very precise action that happens at a very particular moment, and his ability to kind of organize a lot of data. So I don't think that counterterrorism is going to be that thing for these, and it would probably be a bad thing if they did it. I'll just put that out there because it would probably lead to failure.
We haven't really talked about state-sponsored terrorism much, and I was just wondering how much of a concern that should be for the transatlantic, relationship, and is there much indication that states are sponsoring networks or groups who are planning terrorist attacks against the United States and Europe?
For the United States, it shows up a lot in war zones, right? So Pakistan is, actively involved in supporting an array of groups in Afghanistan that are killing U.S. forces, right? By the way, for those of you interested, Steve Cole's new book, Director Ness, is awesome. The Iranians are supporting an array of groups in Iraq and Syria that may come into conflict with U.S. forces, right? For the most part, they haven't, but that's always a very distinct worry. The big issue to me in Europe, and I know less about the European side, is actually Russia, right? It depends how broadly we consider Europe, right? But if we want to say Ukraine is Europe, right, then state-sponsored violent actors are exceptionally active, right? Thousands are there and have had a fairly decisive impact on the battlefield, right? So certainly they're there. I wouldn't call the Russian actors, I don't think terrorism is a particularly good lens for that. I would use kind of a broader unconventional warfare lens because they're really operating, across the spectrum from, individual assassinations to cyber ops to fairly large-scale paramilitary and conventional ops. So I don't think the terrorism lens buys us too much there, but certainly Russia is supporting an array of somewhat nasty actors in parts of its neighborhood.
I would just add that regardless of the capacity of states to actually inflict any damage through state-sponsored terrorism, that the policy paradigm opens a lot of tools that particularly the United States uses in order to constrain the actions of those states. That's maybe very long-winded, but there's several parts of the Patriot Act in particular that allow the Treasury, for example, I don't know if people follow the secondary sanctions regime, is basically, it allows the US government to restrict how banks can operate if they're suspected that they have a connection to state-sponsored terrorism. So you could be a French bank, you're doing something with Iran, then the US government could say, hey, French bank, we're not gonna give you access to the US market because you have this access to a state-sponsored, somebody that's sponsoring state terrorism. And so the US government then has a lot of tools at its, available to it by activating this claim of state-sponsored terrorism. And so it's a very important part of the counterterrorism conversation, but also how the US uses coercive authority in the international system because it can play off, and Iran is doing state-sponsored terrorism, but it's just not directly a homeland threat, but that doesn't matter to these kind of legalistic, what the US government can do in response.
In regard to Brexit, have you seen or do you anticipate there'll be more challenges with intel and information sharing in the security community transatlantic?
I don't think, I mean, the information kind of wings of the British government are not integrated in some way into the European Union, so everybody has their own, basically, intelligence community still. So I don't think that will be disrupted. It will be disrupted because the United Kingdom is basically going to be in disarray for the next 15 years, and so their capacity to really focus on these issues will be degraded, and whether they'll have money to invest in upgrading these things, the United Kingdom probably has the best signaling intelligence after the United States, or Israel maybe, I don't know, it's somewhere in there. But whether they're going to keep investing in that when they have all of these other demands and all of these other crises that they're going to be facing, I think that's probably it's a more long-term degradation than kind of an immediate problem.
Just in the last week or so, the Metropolitan Police's head of counterterrorism talked about the threat of right-wing terrorism that he saw as particularly strong in the UK. And you both talked about the different cultures within Europe, between Europe and America, as it comes to counterterrorism. And I'm not sure this question pertains exactly to transatlantic cooperation, but I wondered if you would have anything to say about the differences in cultural priorities between Europe and the US vis-a-vis right-wing extremism.
So this is something that until the US, 9/11 was a kind of, I'll say, defining event for the United States in terms of what is terrorism, right? So terrorism is 9/11, right? And even though that was a kind of off-the-charts attack in a variety of ways, It's large scale. It involves Muslims. It's on broad targets for the most part that are somewhat random, right? Now the Pentagon is not a random target, the Capitol is not a random target, but the World Trade Center, a lot of different people, nationalities and so on. And a lot of terrorism, though, isn't that way. It is directed against specific communities or specific targets, right? And if you're not part of those communities, you can deplore it, but your kids are fine, right? And so we see this in a whole variety of kind of anti-minority violence in the United States, where there might be people who say that's wrong and it's horrible, but understandably, people in those communities are far more engaged than people outside those communities, as you would expect. And right-wing terrorism in the UK, in the United States, has tended not to target, it would be unlikely a right-wing terrorist group would put a bomb in the Washington, D.C. metro. Right? Now, would they put a bomb at a historically black church? Sure. Right? Might it kill the same number of people? Sure. But for a lot of people, that's a big difference, because unless you're part of that community, you're going to be okay. And that has profound political consequences. Right? So it's seen as kind of a law and order problem. It's seen as it's a bad thing problem, as opposed to it's a threat to everyone. Right? And so historically they're treated very differently. And because in the United States, right-wing terrorism for many years has not had the mass casualty effects, it's been seen more as the nuisance. But if you just look at the numbers, they're massive, right? So now they're often massive, not in a high death toll count, but in a high harassment count, right? So a lot of people beaten up, things that are vandalized, things that are kind of on the lower level of terrorism. So to me, I think there are political reasons why they're treated very differently, but that doesn't actually reflect the danger or the disruption they cause.
And I would just add that there are, an interesting place to look would be a community like Germany, which, it's the same question of what is the society's concern with this issue? So in Germany, for most of the post-war period, it was right-wing terrorism. That was what the intelligence agencies, they were counting every year. It's how many organizations, neo-Nazi organizations, how many people were killed, and so when Muslim extremism happened and that became this thing, that was actually a shift for those organizations to refocus their efforts, from that to that. Similarly, in Germany, left-wing terrorism was very common. So the Red Army faction, so that was another thing that they were very attuned to and kind of would talk about as terrorism and were tracking. And so I definitely think that there's a lessons learned, to think about how do we deal with these different communities, and there are countries that have experienced these kinds of terrorist actions before. I mean, I think with the United States, the thing is that, this isn't a new problem, so we need to kind of address it as that it's a structural problem. It's not just random lone wolves that are doing these things, but it's part of structural racism that's happening, and that we need to address it as such. So I don't think the name matters, whether you call it terrorism or it's, people being terrible, whatever it is, but we have to then focus on that these aren't just all lone wolves actions, but these people have connections to each other, they're systematic, they have an ideology that they're pursuing, and they're using violence. And once it uses violence, then we have to cross the line, we have to address it.
I think we're just going to take one more question, and we'll thank our speakers and get them on their way to their next engagements. Who wants to do the last one?
Could you talk a little bit about the Balkans in terms of being both on Europe's periphery as potential member states and also being transatlantic through NATO? Do we have more agility and flexibility in handling issues like returning foreign fighters there, or intelligence cooperation and such, or do you think this is kind of a weak area of our counter-terrorism policy, especially in terms of organized crime and how they're able to, human trafficking, get guns into Europe in terms of the Paris attack?
So I'll say a little. As some of you know, the Balkan states have some of the highest foreign fighter mobilization rates per capita of any part of Europe. In a number of places, the state itself is relatively weak, right? And that can be manifest in corruption or delivery of services. It can be manifest in the kind of strength of its intelligence services. And so if a foreign fighter goes back to Denmark, if they go back to France, very likely, not 100%, but very likely the government's going to know about it, significantly less likely in the Balkans. And so, to me, this is a relative weak spot for a problem that, as you know my thoughts, I think it's gone reasonably well. I think the Balkans are a concern. But from the point of view of the rest of Europe, they're very focused on the Balkans, not particularly because of terrorism, but just because of crime. Right? So there's a kind of an organized crime nexus, there's a drug nexus, their weapons have often come from the Balkans to other parts of Europe. So there's already a tension and capacity on this issue, and this is something that Abe said that I think was a good reminder to me at least, which is so much depends on what governments have done in the past, right? Which is they have this kind of built-up strength already. And part of it is focused on the Balkans, not solely on terrorism grounds, but because of other issues.